I'm Joe Letteri, Senior Visual Effects Supervisor at Weta Digital, and I think we'll talk a little bit possibly about the Hobbit, the trilogy we just finished this year, and also this year we finished Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. The Hobbit films had an interesting storyline. We start off in Bag End. It's Middle Earth, it's New Zealand, it's all landscape photography. We're introducing the characters, the dwarves. We're sort of finding our way through the journey. But what you see happening as they take off on this journey through Middle Earth, we start to move more and more away from natural landscape and even natural characters and moving more and more into a Middle Earth that we had to create essentially digitally. So that by the time we get to the Battle of the Five Armies, most of what you're seeing happens in a digital world. We shot a lot of green screen for our principal actors for the drama moments, but the large majority of the battle, the armies, the major villains, Azog and Bolg, these are digital characters, digital armies, and digital landscape. So hopefully that progression happened naturally enough throughout the three films that you feel like going on this journey, that you're still in the same world of Middle Earth, but in fact, you've gone from a completely natural world to an almost completely digital one by the time of that third battle. For a lot of the close-in work, we do rely on our actors, whether it's on location or on set or on a green screen. And Peter's very good about incorporating that into the storytelling. He's done that ever since the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where you have films that are epic in scope, but he always brings it back to the personal. That's always our touchstone. And so we've learned that style of filmmaking along with him, and we make sure we can always come back to that. And from a visual effects point of view, one of the things that really makes that work for us is to have our characters and our landscape as interactive with the human characters as possible. For us, it was really great to start off the Hobbit films with the Gollum riddles in the dark sequence, because that was one of my favorite scenes from the book, when I read it as a kid. But it also allowed us to come full circle, because when we did the Lord of the Rings trilogy, we were working with Andy Serkis. We had this idea of doing motion capture to use Andy's performance as the basis for the Gollum character, but he had to go back and re-record that performance after everything else was shot, even though he did a lot of the acting on set. It was all duplicated on a motion capture stage. But through the years, we've been really trying to work out how you build character performance into filmmaking. And this idea of virtual production that we kind of started with Avatar allowed us to continue that on with Rise of the Planet of the Apes. And there our breakthrough was we figured out how to do the performance capture live on set with all the other set lights and actors and everything else that's going on. So we had Hobbit in mind as like a homecoming. So it was great to be able to pull Andy into his performance capture suit, have him working, right there with Martin Freeman and Peter directing him, and to have that be our first 2 weeks of the Hobbit shoot. So it was really a big homecoming moment from having finished Lord of the Rings, 10 years before that. We really just stayed true to the character as much as possible. We brought the old Gollum back online and, rebuilt him so that he maintained the same shape. Like from the outside, he looked the same, but he was completely rebuilt to have an incredible amount of detail, probably 100 times as much details as he had when we did the trilogy. And again, having Andy be the heart and soul of the character really kept us, on track with what Gollum's performance on screen was going to be. The ability to capture everything live and put it together in the moment really brought it all together for us. We've done a lot of work since the Lord of the Rings trilogy on skin rendering and on eyes and, everything else that goes into building a character, muscles, tissue, bone structure. When we did it on Lord of the Rings, we were sort of guessing. We knew we needed something to make the skin soft. We came up with subsurface scattering. We know we needed some way to do the muscles. We had a dynamic muscle system. But by the time we had gone through King Kong and Avatar, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and then back to Hobbit, we had rebuilt all of these systems and refined them tremendously. So now we have a physically based muscle model. We have a physically based skin model. We have, proper caustics happening in the eyes, an incredible amount of detail that gets built into the eyes, physically and geometrically that we could never have done 10 years ago. So all these advances are both in service of staying the same, but making it better, really just trying to break through whatever barriers we had 10 years ago. We planned from the start to reuse as much as possible, but still, because the story moved from location to location to location, we knew that every film was, in essence, going to be like starting over again. For example, we got to use Gollum on the first film. That was great, but he never came back. And we had two other films that would have been great to see him again, but it just wasn't part of the story. But then we had new characters that we could introduce, like Bolg and Azog, who could carry across, the second and the third film. So some things we were able to reuse and to carry on. All of our digital doubles of the doors, for example, of course, that made sense that we would need them the whole way through. So we planned it with that in mind. But we also had a bigger scope in mind, which is we knew the third film, finishing with the battle, was just going to be a huge rendering challenge. And so we started off writing our new renderer called Manuka, our path tracing renderer, with the idea that we would need that fully in production by the time we did the battle, just to manage those big battle scenes. Because you have the complexity of dealing with so much geometry, so much density, and you also have just the physical light transport that you want to get correct, that you want to avoid all the tricks that we had to do, when we were making rings a long time ago, and to just really make sure that we understood it properly. And so we had that kind of dual goal in mind, reuse as much as we can, but crack into as much new technologies as we could to make it all happen. Peter uses Previs as kind of a forerunner to virtual production. And he really embraced virtual production on these films, especially at the end of the second film when we did the Forges sequence with Smog and throughout the entire battle scene. So in other words, Peter won't previs something that he knows he can just go out and shoot live action. What he'll use previs for is to come up with big ideas. And we generally do these really long, massive previs takes, minutes long of animation that's actually fairly well refined, because Peter will then go onto the stage with a virtual camera and he'll find his shots. He'll treat it just like it's a live action shoot. Therefore the performances have to be good. Where in the past you could have gotten away with blocking animation for those kinds of stage shoots, that's no longer the case. So animation and previs really kind of our blurred line these days. We do a tremendous amount of animation to get the dynamics that Peter wants. He'll get in there and put a camera on it. He'll give us his cut, and then we'll take that and really start to refine it for the final animation. When we were doing Avatar and trying to work with Lightstorm to get all these assets on and off the stage, we realized there was a real bottleneck in dealing with dense amounts of geometry that we were going to need to solve for future production, and especially for The Hobbit. And that's where a lot of our R&D effort went into for the Hobbit film. So we wrote a new platform called Olympus that's essentially our pipeline. But one of its major goals is handling extremely large data sets. And that was great because it allowed us on stage to have the whole Battle of the Five Armies environment, plus thousands and thousands of characters, using a couple of different tools. One called Army Manager that was just a quick version of blocking out large movements of characters, but also we could have dozens and dozens of animation playing back, recorded specific animation that Peter could then put cameras on. So it was this combination that gave us a real sense that when you picked up that virtual camera, you were looking at a complete shot. We tried to make sure there weren't gaps. Your composition, your framing, everything was based on what was on the ground and what was in the valley all around. When Peter was shooting the battle, he could get a low angle shot and still frame Ravenhill up in the background, and it was there. We put all the geometry in the scene so he could move anywhere he wanted into that scene. And he could shoot, both sides of the armies coming together and clashing. I mean, just a tremendous amount of detail. And I think that's, a lot where I see virtual production going these days, is you want it to be as realistic as possible and to handle what in the real world you take for granted with all of its complexity. What virtual production has really changed is sort of the rhythm of visual effects filmmaking. It used to be that you would shoot a live action plate, leave a gap for whatever creature was going to go in there, whatever set extension there was done. You would get the film turned over, the director would talk about what he or she wanted, and you'd go to work and putting that in there. In other words, that plate was your starting point. Now with virtual production, that line is blurred. So for example, in the Hobbit films, Peter was involved using these tools as part of the shot design process. We were doing essentially, visual effects production before there were shots. And so Peter would pick this up and use the camera and use the blocking and work with the stunt performers and the actors directly to rough everything out like it was a live action shoot. Turn it over to us, we'd start working on it as if it were a shot, and then he would, at that point, have the ability to refine it, take it all back to the stage, alter the camera, get new performances, bring in different action. So rather than it being a handoff from live action to visual effects, it's now a big loop. And we can circle through that many times until the shots are refined exactly the way the director wants them. And there's all that work then that goes into it throughout that whole process back and forth before it goes to film. So that's been one of the big changes. Well, in a film like Apes, it's a lot more one-to-one because the characters are human size, and by and large, at least in Dawn and Rise of the Planet of the Apes, they lived in the real world, so they were part of the plate. And you would get Andy's performance or any of the other ape performers, and we would do clean passes and all the traditional things you would do and paint them out and replace their performances with what we were able to capture. But by the third act of Dawn, where we had the big fight between Caesar and Koba in the skyscraper, we were into a full virtual production for that. Again, Matt Reeves was directing, Andy and Toby Kebbell, their performances on a virtual capture stage, and the camera, the scene, the skyscraper, none of it was real, so it was done as a full-on virtual production.